Okay, today's topic is structuralism. And I've lectured on structuralism before and specifically talked about Ferdinand de Saussure. And I'm going to talk about him at the end of the video, but I'm just going to try and provide a link to that previous lecture specifically on Saussure, which I gave, I don't know how many years ago now, but whenever I've taught this course, which has been 10 times over 20 years, something like that, I come back to that, and I don't really have a lot to add to what I said about Saussure, but if you want to know more about Saussure, look at that video. I wanted to do today a little bit of a more in-depth look into the background of structuralism and tie it in with the lecture that I gave last semester when I was talking about the origins of Romanticism and the move away from a type of poetics that would have been what we would call classical. So it was to account for a shift between classical poetics, which spanned arguably back to Plato, but certainly from the time of Aristotle all the way up until the 18th century, and included the Christian appropriation of the Aristotelian approach. So that, roughly speaking, is called classicism, and it includes the Christianization of the classical approach. And what I wanted to account for is I think, quite frankly, revolutionary shift on what happens in language that I note in the Romantic period as a Romantic scholar. Because Romantic poetics sees Romanticism as a progressive universal poetry. And I cited the German writer Friedrich Schlegel on this. So he calls poetry progressive, or Romanticism rather, progressive universal poetry. And that sense of universality and progression in poetics is very much at odds with the tradition of poetics, which sees poetry as a inheritance that is, it's the reality of the way poetics works, and there's no progress inherent in it per se, not in the sense that the Romantics ascribe to it. And certainly it doesn't include the universal feature of poetics that comes thereafter, which I think, and last time I spoke about this, entails the Enlightenment's idea of their prejudice against prejudice. So they get beyond all prejudice by looking at things universally. And what I said last time is from the perspective from nowhere, the view from nowhere, citing Nagel's work. They want to get outside all forms of conditioning and prejudice by appealing to the universal. So something that can have no conditions on it. That's the perspective that is sought to be taken as a means of advancing the humanities. So let me just say a little bit. What I want to do, though, at the beginning here, before coming to Saussure, because he will come at the tail end of the lecture, is to try and set structuralism in the context of this movement to look at language as a human achievement, a human and of human origin, which takes place in the late 17th, early 18th century. And I've cited a few works here. So just let me dig down into that a little bit. And I think what I'm going to try and demonstrate, at any rate, is that structuralism arises to solve the problems inherent in that initial project to try and understand human language from a human perspective, rather than the way it was done traditionally. So by the mid-1700s, certainly, this idea of the nature and role of poetry takes on a different tenor because of what happened in the natural sciences, I think. So because of the experimental method in philosophy, in natural science and in mathematics, and you can cite names like Descartes and Bacon and Pascal and Leibniz and Newton using that same experimental methodology. There arose speculations about the divine origin of man's linguistic abilities, or rather about the natural origins rather than the divine origin. Previously, they had been considered of divine origin. Even in the classical age, where they did not know that, or would not acknowledge that man was made in God's image, and that language is a function of being made in the image of God. It's one of the communicable attributes of God, that we use words and we understand reality through words, and the signs in language point to the things of the world, which themselves, as Plato shows, connote ideas and universality to them. They're not just specific things that we name, but they have a larger framework of reference. Rather than seeing it in divine origin, it wants to find it in a natural origin. And so that shift, which is never mentioned, I've never read it anywhere. We talk about the Copernican shift of Nicholas Copernicus. We talk about the Kantian shift of making the objects conform to our capacity to perceive them in the Critique of Pure Reason, but we don't talk about the study of language as of natural origin. But I think that that is precisely what leads to contemporary literary theories and the problems that reside therein. So that's my thesis. And I'm going to try and demonstrate how this comes about, how structuralism arises out of this attempt to understand language naturalistically. Because I think there are inherent problems there that we can see are identified very early on. And yet the project of attempting to understand language from a naturalistic perspective, just empirically, leads to certain, I think, ineluctable problems. You can't avoid the outcomes of the problems. It's a crisis. And all the attempts to solve the problems just create further problems. And I called this the crisis of the human sciences in my doctoral thesis, which then became a book. So language is seen as the defining feature of humanity, just like it would be in a theological framework, although here it's seen as the solely defining feature of humanity. Solely defining. Language is effectively what makes us who we are, which is a rather extraordinary thing. But it's such an important focus. And so it's not denied that language is of no importance. It's ascribed almost absolute importance. Language is. And hence, the essays that I talked about here, I'll get into my discussion of how these works relate to each other, but just the title, Condillac's essay on the origin of human knowledge. So he wants to look at the origin of all human knowledge. Likewise, Rousseau, his discourse on the origin of inequality among men, or his later essay on the origin of languages. I'm not sure if it's earlier or later, what they are written in and around the same time. But they want to get back to the origin of language as a way of understanding. How can human beings understand? So that there's an intense focus. If the origin isn't God, where is the origin? It's in the material world. It's in the visible world. And so how then do we account for what we attribute to language, which is a capacity to think about that visible world, which is reflected in language? How does that arise? So let me try and answer that question now, at least in accordance with following the line of thinking here. So in France, and probably because of the Académie Française, which is the dominant intellectual force in the late 17th, early 18th century, including in England. You can see the influence of France in English letters. The Battle of the Books by Swift is a discussion of the quarrel of the ancients and the moderns, which is a discussion that's taking place in the Académie Française, and just presenting it in an English form, but which is the greater, the ancients or the moderns, and we'll hold Shakespeare up on the one side, and we'll hold the Athenian dramatists or Homer on the other side, and we'll have a battle of the books there. So the French Academy is dominant in England, and also even in terms of, think of the figures I mentioned earlier, Descartes, Pascal, and company. They have their correspondences in England, in Bacon, and in Newton. And then we have Germans thrown in like Leibniz. But still, that the framework of debate is surrounding the French Academy, I think. It's the dominant cultural force. And in France, an early theory of what is the origin of Romantic poetics starts with this man, Condillac. And he follows John Locke, whom we know in England, in English circles, and his essay concerning human understanding. Now, this is read here in the Anglosphere, the essay concerning understanding, in philosophy classes. And what Locke does is he disputes Descartes' assertion that ideas, or that, let me just read here, he argues against the Cartesian standing, Cartesian principle of innate ideas. They're innate. It's sort of a Platonic position. Actually, we have certain innate ideas which we recall through anamnesis, through recollection. But the idea that we have innate ideas, and he disputes this on the grounds that all ideas stem from perceptions and are known through what Locke calls the signs of our ideas, which are words. So we don't know things innately, we know things through words, which are signs of ideas. So he calls, that's what words are, they're signs. But what are they signs of? They're signs of ideas. They're not signs of the things, they're signs of a higher thing. So if you want to think about the allegory of the cave, they go directly from the sign to the Plato's concept of the ideas, rather than having certain mediating things in between. Remember, he talks about the shadows on the cave as being at a distance from reality. There's a puppet show, there's a light behind the puppet show, it throws shadows on the cave, and the people who are sitting there looking at the cave think that that's reality. But really all they're seeing is the puppet show, and the puppet show is actually just a representation of what goes on outside the cave. So there's three tiers. In Locke, he goes from the shadows all the way to the ideas. There's no puppet show in between. There's no idea of art in there, or artistic representation. He gets rid of that problem. It's just the shadow and then the reality. And the shadow is what the word does then, effectively. I mean, I'm simplifying things here. So Locke calls words the signs of our ideas. And Condillac also disagrees with Descartes, but unlike Locke, who maintains that there's a distinction between signs and ideas of things, remember the res signa distinction in Augustine, he holds that one can dispense with signs, Locke does, in contemplating the reality of things. And because of this, he will move English sort of knowledge towards mathematics. And that, rather than a verbal representation, you'll think that mathematics is a closer approximation to the reality of the ideas of things. Condillac says, no, words are absolutely necessary. We can't dispense with words to understand the reality of things. We need those signs, which we call words, because they are necessary to the primary act of reason, which is the relations between ideas. We can't formulate how ideas relate without language. So language is not dispensable. And relating these ideas through the imagination and reflection is the single principle he mentions in the essay. This is Condillac once again, as the source of all understanding. And so when he inquires into the origin of human knowledge, which is the title of that book, it becomes an inquiry into the origin of the linguistic signs by which ideas are related and knowledge is formed. So it becomes a study of the origin of language then, because of his stance on this. So language then becomes central. And in part 2 here, the origin, which is subtitled On the Origin and Progress of Language, Condillac sketches a history in which the natural signs, the cries of passion, are slowly replaced by instituted signs or articulate sounds. And this is going to sound familiar. So it starts with just expressive, natural signs, grunts and cries. And slowly it gets replaced by instituted or articulate sounds. And so music and gesture and dance are natural signs of the passions. So it is a sort of language when we hear music or when we watch dance. It's closer to an inarticulate expression of reality. And what these do is try to paint the passions in forms that are non-linguistic. But poetry does it in verbal form. But they're all doing effectively the same thing. They're expressing something that is, through a concrete form, something that lies and is common to them all. It's an interesting idea. And you can see this attempt if you want to compare different arts, like music and painting and literature. I sometimes try to do it. I don't do it too extensively, but you can easily trace the attempt in different periods of the musicians and the painters and the poets clearly engaging with common ideas and ways of presenting them. I think it's easiest seen in a painting because you can visualize, but you can hear it in the sounds as well, particularly when you compare it to previous musical compositions and the approaches. But what he does is Condillac, with respect to language, says that figurative language is the most close to the origin of articulate sounds. So poetry and figurative language is closest to natural sensory expression. And so poetry takes on a relevance and an importance not because it was written by Homer, or that the most important expressions of a culture are almost always held in metrical form or in poetic form, which you can see in the Bible as well. Certain formulations have a clearly literary quality to them. Certain little sayings, aphorisms, and so forth that are passed on. When a really important wise saying is there, it gets passed on through memory, and people just cite it without realizing that there's a kernel of memory being passed on in that form. But that's because it's closest to natural sensory experiences. That's his explanation. It's not because it approximates something else, it's because it's closest to sensation. And so sensation is more central to human nature than reasoning, which again is pushing against the Aristotelian classical formulation, which sees reason and language as partners, and if you're going to choose one of the two, then reason is going to arbitrate between the two, which is precisely what Socrates does when he runs in conflict with the poets. He appeals to reason. He doesn't appeal to language. He uses language to appeal to reason, but he's arguing that reason is going to adjudicate over what the poets use, which are words that appeal to the passions. Condillac's emphasis, which is the romantic emphasis, does the exact opposite. Let's go to what's closer to the origin, what's the foundation of all humanity, and that is our base natural sensory expression. In other words, what we share with the animals, who also have that capacity. So Condillac hypothesized that originally poetry and music formed the passionate language in which original societies instituted religion and law. Compare that to the biblical account, where we can see the central focus in the Pentateuch, so the first 5 books of the Bible, is the Decalogue, the revelation of God on Mount Sinai to Moses, the 10 words, thou shalt, etc., and the revelation of who God is, and we are in relation to him. Remember, the first 5 books are the books of Moses, and they even account for the origin of the species, if you will. Adam and Eve, the Garden of Eden, etc. But that's in terms of law and religion, whereas here, the beginning even of law and religion is poetry and music. So this is the emphasis of a naturalistic focus on language, is it's going to see poetry and music as more central to human nature than even law and religion, instituted religions. And eventually, as they get refined, this is his account of what transpires over time. Remember, it's progressive universal poetry. Over time, poetry and music are refined and separated. And so are languages. And writing is developed. Not there at first, but writing, according to Condillac, comes about. And this results in the gradual displacement of poetry by prose, and of poetry by philosophy, which is replaced eventually by science, modern science. So societies, what we see in Augustine and in Horace, the idea that poetry is there to teach and to delight. That's their formulation, which is held all the way to the Renaissance, we saw. To teach and delight, that twofold function. In the Romantic or the pre-Romantic formulation of Condillac and Rousseau, it's not that way. It is that poetry delights and prose teaches. So there's a digression there. Poetry gets pushed more in the direction of pure delight, and prose is there when we really want to understand things and teach it. So that there's a gulf that starts to be created. So poetry became just like music an art of pleasure, and prose is there for instruction. And the divide between them grows more and more pronounced, to the point at which, as C.P. Snow writes or gives in an inaugural lecture in 1959, we have the result. It's a Reed lecture, R-E-D-E. British academic, he's a novelist and a scientist. He calls it the two cultures. We get the sciences on the one hand, we get the arts on the other. And the arts deal with delight, and the sciences deal with knowledge. That account that there's a separation and they have a different focus originates in this period. It's a hypothesis of Condillac. It's a hypothesis of the Geisteswissenschaften. It's a hypothesis of the university, rooted in the idea that language is a naturalistic phenomena we should understand through experimentation, through careful study, and then talk about in terms of prose. But the poetry is only dealing with delight and not dealing with teaching at all, which is, I think, a total misrepresentation of what the tradition actually teaches. But it fits in with the idea of progressive universal poetry. Wherein lies the progress? Moving from poetry towards prose, moving from delight towards knowledge, greater and greater knowledge. So societies initially create and governed by the employment of poetic expression, develop eloquence as a middle ground between them, and eventually they dispense with eloquence altogether, and we have just prose. So you can see this in Augustine, that he talks, remember the teacher of rhetoric, Augustine, talks about the importance of rhetoric, but not rhetoric as practiced by the pagans, because the pagans don't understand the mind of God, and they only want sublimity, and they don't acknowledge the importance of humility, which is rooted in the incarnation and in Christ's own use of language and in poetic, the rhetoric used in Scripture, which is not in the high style of Cicero or Horace. It is rather a very lowly style that we call Koine Greek. And yet it appeals to human nature and is profoundly powerful. How do we account for that power? Well, in this period and thereafter, it will be because it's most closely related to sensation. So it's the most rudimentary form of human expression, closest to sensation and the passions. That's the explanation that comes here. That's not the Christian explanation. The Christian explanation is because of the humility of God expressed in the incarnation and in the crucifixion, where God did not condescend to become human and take on the burden of being a man. Did not think equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself a servant. So that is the focus of Augustine's treatise on rhetoric and the importance of rhetoric, but he still thinks that rhetoric is important, and he doesn't see it as a transition point between poetry, rhetoric, and prose. He doesn't see that at all. He just says that rhetoric, although important, needs to be changed by Christian truth, but not that rhetoric's unimportant, whereas here we think that in the Romantic formulation, we have this evolution from poetry to rhetoric to prose. Now, so Condillac is important, and I haven't mentioned him thus far. That's why I spent a fair bit of time here, 20 minutes, talking about him. These figure in the figure of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who I did mention before, last semester, and also Denis Diderot, who comes up with an encyclopedia in the period. But in this work, the Essai sur l'origine des connaissances humaines, Rousseau supports Condillac's thesis that the first language was natural cries and gestures, and is eventually replaced by articulate sounds and instituted signs. But, and here's the difference, the first words were not synesthetic. They didn't express the whole of the sensations, of hearing, touching, smelling, tasting, seeing. It wasn't, the first cries were not those. Rather, they were paintings or copies of gesture and pure sound. They were copies of sounds. Pure sound, whatever that means. I don't know what a pure sound is exactly. So words are by nature, on the other hand, they only exist by common consent. They are articulated. They only exist by common consent. And that's paradoxically, they would be necessary to the social process by which they are created. And this is the paradox that is never resolved in structuralism. It's never resolved. They say that we need society to determine what words mean. The sounds, we don't need society, but to articulate it, we need society. And yet, the society has to pre-exist in order for the sounds to be articulated and understood. So it refers back to society, but society originates from the use of language. So there's this circle that they never can get out of. Society creates the meaning of the words, but society itself is dependent on these words. And so because there can be no development of language without language, and no language without social relations, Rousseau finds illogical any solution of finding language in looking at language historically. It's all just social convention. We don't need to look at the development, the roots of words, which will be the with the tradition that goes back to the Garden of Eden. If you want to understand a language, understand its original use and the derivations and how it develops over the course of time. That's the postulate of the Oxford English Dictionary. You go to the etymology, go to the roots of the words and see how the language is developed that way. Rousseau doesn't think that that is possible because language only means what society means it to mean. It doesn't mean anything originally other than what was said at the time, but that was just a provisional thing. Language never, ever refers to the reality of ideas. There are no ideas. So you can see an irrationalism in Rousseau's position. By the way, Rousseau, who's writing in the Enlightenment, hates the Enlightenment, can't stand it. He hates the age of reason. He sees it as oppressive to his feelings. It's oppressive to human nature. And he refers language back to feeling. And thinks that language should defend feeling. That's its purpose and function. Not to articulate ideas or point to a transcendental reality, but rather to express feeling. So he takes issue with this, with Condillac, and therein takes the divergence that I mentioned in the lecture. I don't even know when it was, maybe November last year, where there are two paths then of Condillac that refers things, and Locke to some degree as well, that where words are signs that point to ideas, and then the Romantic tradition that say that words are signs that point to feelings. And these diverge within the ranks of those that are studying the origin of language from a scientific perspective, and they never resolve themselves. But the modern, what we refer to as the irrationality of postmodernism, arises from the Rousseauian branch of the approach to studying language from a human perspective. The enlightened approach of Condillac, etc., leads to the idealism of the German school of Kant, etc. And last time I talked about how Heidegger, in a sense, returned us back to the Romantic emphasis by saying that language is the house of being, and that we live within language and we only understand ourselves within language, and there are no ideas outside of language. That sounds very much Romantic. This is his solution to the problems that arise, he says, throughout the history of Western philosophy. I think that it's not a problem in the history of Western philosophy, it's a problem of the 18th century onward. That's how I see that. At any rate, any comments or questions about that? I wanted to give that initial beginning. I'm recapitulating something of what I said before, but I'm adding a little bit there. But that beginning gives rise. And structuralism, which is today's talk, will build on that idea of how do we explain how language functions then? Any questions or observations, or just want me to go on? Yes?
Sorry, so just with Rousseau, he saw that language was like essentially rooted in feelings. And it went back to that originally?
He thinks that language originates in society. And words don't mean anything outside of social construction. And modern romantics, the inheritors of the romantics, think that language only ever refers to itself, and society determines what the words mean, and the words can mean whatever we decide them to mean. Because ultimately, they're dimly representing our feelings, and that's all language ever does. There's no such thing as ideas that we can appeal to adjudicate between a false word and a true word, because ultimately what will determine truth and falsehood is what society decides true and false is. There's no way of correcting it other than socially. And you can't control what society thinks about it other than through, speech codes, like political correctness. In which case, you're not arguing that it's false, you're arguing that it's wrong. What is wrong about using certain words is that it offends somebody. Their sensibilities, their feelings are hurt. So you can't say that word. You can't call somebody this, not because it's not true. It's not even interested in true and falsehood. Again, those are categories that go outside the interests of society. It's that it doesn't express what is central to society, namely its common substrate in feeling. And that's, as I say, and I think that psychology and sociology and anthropology arise out of this view of human nature that sees the commonality of humanity in their shared feelings, and see psychology as the closest exploration of it on an individual basis. So as I say, to some degree I'm talking about literary theory, to another I'm talking about the whole development of the humanities or the human sciences that come out of this, but again, they arise because of this focus on language as an expression of something other than something we share with God. We want to look at it emancipated from the reference back to God. By the way, in case I don't get here, this man, George Steiner, in his work Real Presences, which I read when I was a grad student, believes that there is a idea, even in the text and the work of art, irreducible to analytic summation and resistant to argument, that suggests God everywhere. He calls it Real Presences. That's the essay or the book that he writes in 1989. But there's a necessary reference, even if it's not explicit, but implicit, to the presence of God even in human speech. He authorizes all things. He's not a Christian critic, by the way, but very interesting. And I'm not going to study him on the course because he falls outside the tram lines of studies in literary theory, but I think he's a very interesting, takes a very interesting tack on this. He also writes a work called After Babel, which is studying language more in the sense that we would have seen in the 16th century, which is that what we're trying to do is recover Adam's language. There's an original language that we want to recover by means of studying the diverse forms of languages, and we compile them all together and see what's common, and we come with an original Adamic language. That's the aim of the Renaissance. When they're studying these languages, the biblical scholars, they want to get back to a language that was purer, but not because it's more closer to feeling, but rather because it's closer to the mind of God as Adam had it in his language. That's the aim. Whereas in the 19th century, there is also an aim to get back to an original language, but it's a hypothetical one that they call Proto-Indo-Germanic or Proto-Indo-European. And that will have it's a very different focus. It's universal, and it's going back to origins, but it's not going back to the account of Genesis or the idea that we bear the image of God. It's still a study in language, but it's language divorced of God. And so After Babel is an interesting study there as well, again by Steiner. Very persuasive, excellent writer, by the way, superb writer, unlike most critics. Read Steiner, you love Steiner. You think, this man can write. No wonder the Academy doesn't acknowledge him. Can't possibly be recommending somebody who can write, otherwise we would all be held to a standard of having to be comprehensible and appealing. But structuralism, let me talk about structuralism. So that's just like a sidebar on Mr. Steiner. Structuralism has three strands. I'm going to focus on only one of them, but just to mention them. There is a Prague school, there's a Moscow school, Moscow Tartu school, and then there's a French and American school, and I'm going to focus on the third. But I am going to observe that in both the Prague and the Moscow Tartu schools, the Cold War drives the scholars from that school to America in the 1960s. Very interesting. So in other lectures, public lectures, I've talked about cultural Marxism and how the Frankfurt School were basically communists of a stripe, get driven out of Germany by the Nazis, and they decamp to the United States and they present their theories there. So the Nazis can't stand them and want them gone, largely because many of them are Jewish, so they flee for their lives. But then the theories come across the Atlantic and start to take on significant influence in the American universities in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and onwards. At 40s, they even go to Hollywood. Because they're famous German academics, so they have influence on American culture in ways that are not usually acknowledged. But back to this, the Prague School begins with a study, and I'm just going to briefly summarize it, begins with a study on the internal organization of poetic works. So how do poems work internally? If you just look at the poem and how it relates to itself. And the focus here is not on understanding, but on sound, which is interesting already, very much romantic. So we look at a poem in terms of the internal relations of sounds to other sounds within the poetic work. That's the focus. That's stage one. Stage two is starts applying that focus on sound towards things outside the text, to history, to other social phenomena. And then the Nazis invade Prague, and some of the scholars are driven to the West. And one of them is of particular significance. His name is René Welleck. And Welleck, becomes arguably the most important of the American new critics. But you could also point at Wimsatt and Beardsley. There's a few others in this period. But Welleck establishes that the study of literature ought to be the study of the relations of the poem, the internal relations of the poem. We just study how poems, not anything extrinsic, but just the internal relations of poem, not social, how they reflect the mind of society or universal social progress like the Romantics, but let's just look at poems as poems and not look outside the poem. So you focus as an independent little island in the middle of a sea with no relations to any other islands and no geography outside of it. So it is an island unto itself. So Welleck is influential there, and he is a structuralist of the Praguean variety. In the third period, these Prague writers move to France and the United States. And you will recognize some of the names. Roman Jacobson, maybe you might. And the French anthropologist Claude Levi-Strauss. So note how this structuralist approach is addressing issues related to society and human nature. It's part of it's an anthropological movement as much as it is linguistic. And I'll skip over saying more about that. In terms of the Moscow School, I'm going to skip over it for lack of time, unfortunately. And I'm going to move on to, what did I do with here? Ferdinand de Saussure. But what I say about Saussure as a structuralist, you will find also holds true of others that we will call structuralists. And these names you will read about in textbooks on literary theory. Their names are mentioned over and over and over and over. And what are these names? Roland Barthes, who we are going to look at, the death of the author. So So Roland Barthes. Julia Kristeva. Now these figures often oppose one another and are different in many ways. Gérard Genet, Svetan Todorov, and so forth. Genet. I think it's two N's. Is that correct? No, it's not. It's one end. May not misrepresent him. So these are structuralists that have whose work gets transported into the United States, and they are very influential, as is Jacques Derrida, whom I have not yet mentioned. But the early Derrida we would see as a structuralist until he recognizes or sees the problems with structuralism and then starts to deconstruct it. And so he turns against structuralism, but he misconceives the project of structuralism as if it were equal to the humanities tradition going back to the ancient world, rather than a reaction against it that began in the early 18th century. So he's going to write about Plato and Aristotle and other writers, and scripture for that matter, and he's going to deconstruct them all as if they were all working in accordance with the postulates that the structuralists themselves invent. They think that all language works in a structural fashion, and it reflects views of language that originate in the 18th century, but he ignores that shift and acts as if it were valid throughout all of human history. And deconstruction is now a big deal in Christian circles, deconstructing the faith and so forth. I think it's rooted to this whole movement and misconceptions about what Christian theology actually teaches, in which, unfortunately, they've often borrowed ideas about what language does and who God is in relation to these anthropological theories of the 18th century, and place more emphasis on feelings than they do on words, which you find in worship services all the time, to the point where you will notice this in choruses. You sing the chorus, depending on how charismatic you are. If you're more charismatic, you sing it 10 times, or you can sing it ad infinitum, and the effect of this is that you forget the words and you get caught up in the feeling. And at the end of it all, you could just say or whatever, or namaste, because effectively you are getting beyond the words and into the feeling, the mindset of the group identity. That's what's going on in a Christian service, is you're moving beyond the word to what lies behind the word, which is the feeling. That's the effect of this, and I think it's even the intent of it. It defies rationality, it defies order, and it appeals to a commonality that's rooted in a very animalistic thing, a very monistic thing, and a very panentheistic thing, which is the unity of all things, which is what you get when you don't think about things, which is what you do when you sing enough choruses. Mind-numbing as they are, even in their first stanza, if you repeat it ad infinitum, then there's nothing left. I guess you know what I think about contemporary worship choruses. Anyway, so these, and I'll mention a few other. Michel Foucault will also be a structuralist, and Jacques Lacan. Lacan takes more of a psychoanalytic approach, but still they're all, roughly speaking, in the structuralist camp, or at least that's where they begin. So the French scholars of the 20th century are almost all rooted in structuralism, but they're also almost all pointing to Heidegger. Which I've mentioned Heidegger already, but they see Heidegger and his project of focusing on language as the house of being, and saying that there's no reality outside of the text, which is what René Welleck says. And the American New Critics, they're very much influenced by structuralism. Hence, we look at structuralism before we move on to that, and we'll look at Derrida or Heidegger more closely in its own lecture. But in general terms, structuralism can be opposed to all theories which attempt to explain phenomena individually. So language is individually. It's a generalizing thing. And the key figure is this man, Ferdinand de Saussure. He is the figure that we associate with and really interesting on this. Sometimes I post these online, and I have people in India that watch my lectures, and they commented that Saussure got this from his study of Sanskrit. His theory of language and the way words relate to other words, and they derive their meaning only in relation to words relating to other words and not to things. They said they got that from Hindu ideas about reality arising in relation to nothingness, because being and nothingness are effectively two sides of the same coin in Hinduism. Hinduism is, by the way, a word that was made up by Westerners, referring to the river Sindh in India, and they just came up with, well, whatever the local religion is, they called it Hinduism, as if it were there was this one thing called Hinduism. There is no such thing. It's just polytheism, and there are no scriptures. Those were created after the fact. When the explorers came there, they wrote it down. There had been none before. So they posited this thing called Hinduism, which really is just a form of pantheism, or polytheism, or whatever, panentheism at any rate, very much amenable to the Romantic mindset and the irrationalism inherent, and actually to some degree the anarchy built in the system. So that has an effect on Saussure's study of linguistics. Remember, Saussure, like many in his era, are very well read and are able to know multiple languages. So this is not just theorizing. He is trying to look at, in keeping with the Proto-Indo-Germanic language, let's look at the Indo. Let's study the languages of India and see them as maybe allies or closely connected to Western languages, and let's posit something common to that. What is that common tongue? It's not the language of Adam and Eve in the garden. It's a universal language. It doesn't appeal to the Tower of Babel, that discourse. It appeals to its early origin, and its early origins, per this, are in our feelings. And then different societies come up with their own articulated meanings, and some of them are remarkably similar, but some of them are very different. And we can't discriminate between true languages, or different languages have a different conception of reality, which are closer to reality, and the answer is none of them, or all of them. So we have to value all languages equally. We can't discriminate whether one is a better repository of understanding the world than one other, because in every case, it's just expressing the feelings of those in the culture at that particular moment. So it relativizes all things. And you can see why, even if it's not intentionally calibrated against Christianity, it is inevitably so. Because in the Christian understanding, we will all be united by our nature in the Word of God, and also by His revelation in terms of our way of understanding God and the world. And we will employ notions of truth and falsehood which are antithetical to Eastern religions. I think that's a Western rationalist way of looking at things. And maybe it is, in the sense of its historical legacy, but does that mean, is it because it's Western that it's true? Or is it true in the West because the gospel went out first to the West and influenced the way they looked at the world, and then that way of looking at the world happened to make human life better because it accorded with revelation? And that's my contention. It's the contention of an Indian writer who I would strongly recommend you read, by the name of Vishal Mangalwadi, and I'll write it down because it's a bit of a mouthful. He's very good on this. As a non-Westerner, seeing the effect of biblical assumptions in the Western way of looking at the world, differing from his own native India. It's a Christian adult convert, and looks at it that way. And very interesting works. I recommend them, and think you'll find them very interesting. Just in terms of perspective, sees things from the outside, as it were. But back to Saussure. Saussure is the founder of modern linguistics, and he distinguishes between concrete speech acts, what he calls parole, and the underlying system of the language, what he calls langue. So he's a Swiss, he writes in French. When I say writes, his general study of linguistics was not a book he wrote, it was something that his students from their lecture notes compiled after he passed, and that became his influential work. So he lectured, he didn't have a book, but a book was written, pardon me, after the fact, and of course it's from his public lectures there at the University of Geneva, I believe. And langue is a formal entity whose elements have no positive or inherent qualities. No positive qualities, no inherent qualities, but are defined solely in relational terms. Only relative, never universal. Now, the synchronic study treats language as a formal system of interrelated elements functioning at a particular time. And that takes priority over a diachronic study, which studies the history of the language. So it's all moving, and the reason why then he will prioritize the synchrony is that it is universal. It will see all cultures and all languages as effectively similar, not one superior to another. And it, again, fitting with the idea of the universality that is sought after in the European project, again, divorced from any influence of history then. It's a non-historical approach. He doesn't want to look at it diachronically over the course of time. So which language results in human flourishing? Which is closer to the truth. You could look at the different languages. Yes, they all speak different languages, but which language is full of sense and which one is more nonsense, more or less? Is there a difference between them? Well, if you look at them diachronically, you would probably say, you would have to say, yes, this doesn't work. They can communicate, but they can't communicate truths that are going to lead them culturally to flourish. Whereas if we look at them synchronically, what they have all in common, then we'll eliminate what distinguishes them and see the commonality as the basis of a common humanity. By the way, one of the effects of this is it puts the university professor in a supreme cultural position. This is the priesthood of the new humanity, the university professor. Not a representative of any one religion, but representative of the religion of humanity. Divorced of every specific cultural feature, just like the UN of sorts, right? It's sort of a corollary to that. Now, the French anthropologist Claude Levi-Strauss, who's a central figure for structuralism, adopts this perspective in anthropology. So in the field of, I've mentioned anthropology as a new discipline from the 18th century, the study of man as man from a historical perspective, and then positing the idea of primitive man, inarticulate grunts and cries, the cavemen, etc., giving rise to later and later and more from poetic to rhetorical to prosaic ages of articulation, but greater and greater understanding of the world. He will study anthropology in this way. Very influential in anthropology. And we'll find the same thing in psychology. To some degree, Freud does this. He sees stages of childhood development and connects them to, oral stages and, child's self-bodily awareness. And that is used as an explanation for humanity in general. But again, sensation, but now at the ages of a child's development. And psychological problems are explained by reference to early childhood experience and unresolved guilt feelings, etc., etc. So, but feelings are the issue in psychology, at least in the Freudian cast. Levi-Strauss rejects attempts to explain social and cultural phenomena in a piecemeal fashion, in an individual way. He wants a formal system for it. The code, what's the code to society? In other words, he's trying to take a religious perspective on humanity. That's what they're trying to do, a common feature of all societies and all ages. So he will study primitive logic, he will study totemism, he will study myth, or what he calls the logic of the concrete, and the conceptual systems that enable people to think about and organize their world. And so he will say that indigenous ways of knowing are just different ways of knowing than Western ones, and we shouldn't privilege Western rationalistic ones. Why not? Why would you not do that, especially if you're in the West? Why would you not privilege your own way of knowing things over those of other cultures? Well, the appeal will be to the the iniquitous effects of colonialism or some other things. But you could avoid those and say, yes, those were barbaric acts, but that doesn't mean the way of thinking and knowing was wrong per se. It was individuals acted barbarically, unjustly, whatever, and you wouldn't have to be the whole way of thinking about the world that would be responsible, but they say it is. It's the way you think about things that is the source of the problem. So the way we avoid that is get rid of everything Western from the West and embrace a broader, universal perspective on humanity that will emphasize the felt and the irrational and the contradictory. Because again, the appeal to the laws of logic of Aristotle, the three laws of logic, is just that. It's a Western appeal. And the laws of logic are not acknowledged in India. The Hindus did not come to the idea that there's one God, or that there are ideas that unite human beings. They have different castes that differentiate there, and they're fixed and so forth. Anyway, but these codes are by which myths operate are sets of binary oppositions. This is a key point. Of binary oppositions drawn from different areas of experience, which can be used to express a variety of contrasts. So that's how the differentiation, it's through binary, but again, the binary is again just a relational thing. So black is not something discrete unto itself. It means what it means in antithesis to the white. Likewise, male, there's no such thing as male. Male is not female. It's just binary oppositions. Good is not categorically distinguishable from evil. It's a relational term. There's no absolute good, there's no absolute evil. There's no absolute male, there's no absolute female. There's not an actual definition there. Or the definition comes from the society that terms these things this, and it could term them something else. And so they'll point to cultures where there are different gender roles, where in terms of the priesthood, we find androgynous figures, which is almost the case in all pagan societies. The religious figure is androgynous, which is interesting. And by the approach to androgyny is getting to a higher form of human nature aside from the specific differentiation of the two sexes. That's the contention there. But that binary explanation comes for everything and gives rise to something that we're going to call, which is related to this, called semiotics, or the science of signs. So there are two fundamental insights here in structuralism, or structuralism is based on. Number one, social and cultural phenomena don't have essences. There are no essences. Instead, social and cultural phenomena are defined both internally, structurally, and also by their place in other structures, like the langue, the broader structure of a universal language. And secondly, social and cultural phenomena are signs that refer to other signs, but never things, because things are essences. Remember the res insignia discussed in Augustine last semester? Here we have the signa pointing to other signa. A sign points to another sign, and they will say, and this becomes a sort of a mantra, there is no transcendental signified, by which we would refer to God, which is an assertion of will rather than reality. Because what if a society determined that there was one? Then it still wouldn't exist, but nothing exists in this system anyway, because there's never any essence. So to say that there is no transcendental signified, there's no signified at all. There's only the constant interplay of signs. That's Derrida's whole point. It's one sign pointing to another sign, but there is no signified ever. It's just an endless play of signifiers. You never get to the essence, because getting to the essence is impossible in a system that's predicated on a linguistics that is binary but gets the meaning from the signs relationally. It never points to a real woman, a real man, a real instance of injustice, a real instance of justice. There is no such thing. It's just socially determined. So social and cultural phenomena are signs, not physical events only, but events with meaning. And as I say, I refer you to my lecture on de Saussure, where I talk a little bit more about this. But I didn't root it in a problem of the 18th century, which is, as the course has progressed, as I've taught it over the years, I'm now convinced is the case. It's not a problem that originates in the development of the Geisteswissenschaft in the 19th century. Those go back to the earlier problems of the approach to studying language as if it were a human artifact, and we can look at it divorced from theology. And as I say, it's expressed in the university in Germany by throwing theology right out of the university. It's not a study within the university at all. That comes after the French Revolution, by the way. It's interesting that this whole movement towards a new sort of humanism that we construct is concurrent with a hostility towards the past, and in particular with Christian theology. Very strong. Within the Christian universities even, it becomes sort of swamps universities that began as Christian and were doctrinally Christian, and eventually the ideas overtake and their views of language, which is why I still think that my discipline of literature is an important beachhead in the recovery of a proper understanding of the world, because this is where the problem originates. Any comments or questions? Because I realize I'm running fast at a time here, and I could say more, but I'm not. I need to give you a second. Any thoughts? Yes, yes.
Saussure said that signs or signifiers relate to concepts and not things.
Yes.
Is there some sort of analogy, I suppose, or connection between that and Kant, where he says that essentially you can only know concepts and representations because you only interact with the sensation as it's constructed by the categories?
I think so. I think he's caught in a Kantian universe of subjective ideas conforming to our, or the reality of the world conforming to our capacities to perceive it. And yes, it refers to concepts. And I do think he has Kant in view there. Yes, I do. And so again, in the Kantian way of looking at things, there is no reality out there that we can know, or if it is known, it's only known by looking internally at the categories of understanding. Structuralism is also dependent on the Kantian turn as well. Yes, I think so. But again, there's no world of things. It's a very odd approach.
Would Saussure acknowledge something like a noumenal realm, like what Kant?
Not to my knowledge. I think that because that contradicts his view of how language works. How can we know something noumenal that is outside our? Well, we could call it God, but I don't think it would be have any particular validity for him, and certainly not as in anything like the sense of God which underlies the Western tradition, which is God is the source of all reality, defines reality. So you can have something called God, yes, and you can oppose him to the devil, but it's going to be just a binary opposition between good and evil, and that it's not going to be with the fulsome sense of God as the creator of the universe, the author of human nature, of the crucified Christ and risen Christ, the end of the Alpha and the Omega, the concluder of the one in whom meaning is understood and so forth. That's gone. But the category of God, just as a placeholder, he could talk about that. It's an idea. And it might be a great idea. Like Jordan Peterson is in the same mental framework. It's a great idea. It's very important to your life that you believe in God. Because otherwise it's chaos and meaning. Live as if it were true. It's almost like a Pascal's wager type thing. Well, I'd rather do that than this, because look at the consequences of not believing in God. It's chaos and it's evil. So don't do that. Act as if God were true and as if we could know God. But of course we can't know God, says Jordan Peterson. Why? Because again, he operates within this linguistic framework. This is how language works as it evolves. He's an evolutionary psychologist. Right? And so he will root the understanding of language as a sort of phenomena expressing our feelings, and it gets more and more articulated, more and more rational in some ways, but ultimately it contradicts a revelation. And you can't bridge that gap by appealing to that same system. You have to say that system is a broken system. It yields chaos. So anyway. So you can't, the antidote to chaos is not more Jordan Peterson or self-authoring. You have to know what yourself is. And we don't define ourselves. God defines who we are and relates to us even. We get our understanding of who we are in relation to how he relates to us, which we find in the person of his son. Right? So if you won't go to Christ, then you're not going to get to God. Just through an intellectual exercise. And anyway, there's a way to finish it.